Thank you for joining us. We're here on the occasion that after President Biden's major news conference today, where he is announcing another plan, a major plan to fight COVID-19. And it has a lot to do with getting what he said, some of the 80 million unvaccinated Americans vaccinated. Two major issues when it comes to your job that we're going to be talking about tonight. Number one, those of you who are not vaccinated and want to know what your rights are as a worker if you choose to remain unvaccinated. Number two, those of you who have been vaccinated and are concerned about working alongside those who are not vaccinated. We're talking about the legal and not the medical part of it tonight. And we're not really going to talk about the political. We're going to talk about what the president's plan means, what it means for you with a legal expert. Joining me now is a legal expert, well-known employment law expert, Peter Sachs of Boca Raton. Peter, welcome and thank you for making the time for us tonight. Peter, do you hear me? Oh, Peter, thank you for joining us right now. Peter Sachs is an attorney with an expertise in employment law tonight. And we are, again, talking about President Biden's plan to vaccinate the unvaccinated and what people's rights are, both if they're unvaccinated and want to stay at their jobs, or if they're vaccinated and concerned about those who they're working alongside. Peter, one of the first plans that the White House mentioned was large employers ensuring workers are vaccinated or tested weekly. This is people with 100 or more employees. Tell me, first of all, if somebody's unvaccinated, what they have to do to either keep their jobs if they work for a business that has 100 or more employees. And around here, those would certainly affect a lot of large businesses, the resorts, large government offices, buildings, and the like. What specifically is this going to mean in employment?
Well, assuming that does become the law, which is an assumption right now, the people who are unvaccinated get a medical excuse for not being vaccinated or a religious excuse for not being vaccinated. If they're working for a private employer, that private employer has the legal right to mandate vaccinations subject to those two exceptions. Or the employer can offer the alternative of taking the COVID test on a regular basis in lieu of being vaccinated.
Now, we've already had a few people that are weighing in on this, and they're saying things like, this is a constitutional right. Is the right not to be vaccinated without, a religious exemption, is that a constitutional right?
Well, we're going to find out, Dave. The portion of the president's plan that talks about mandatory vaccinations for federal employees, in my opinion, is well overdue. Private employers have been doing that for some time. They've started with educating their employees, trying to persuade them, asking them to speak to their physicians. And ultimately, if the private employer determines it's in the best interest of the company to require vaccinations or the alternative testing, the private employer may impose it. And I'm glad to hear the federal government as an employer is finally going to go along with that. It's about time. When you go, though, to the private sector or the states or local governments, I think it's a different situation. And I think private employers and local governments are in the best position to make those decisions as opposed to getting a mandate from Washington.
Well, let's talk about religious exemptions. How easy or how difficult are they able to get? And it almost brings me back to a constitutional debate of a few years ago where these religious groups were saying that, for example, smoking marijuana was part of a religious ritual. They were shot down in the courts, but it seems like, there are some cynics who are watching this who are probably going to think anybody can get a religious exemption for anything. Are they difficult?
They're rare. They're rare. I think it must come from a recognized institutional type religion that has certain precepts. I am not aware specifically of what that religion is or isn't, but I think that if there was evidence from a clergyman or other leader of what otherwise a recognized religion, that would be an exception. But
one of the other points that the president made in his executive orders, requiring vaccination for all federal workers and contractors who do business with the federal government. How airtight is that going to be, and how tough an enforcement is that going to be? Specifically,
I believe the government can enforce that. In fact, here locally, with many of the communities my law firm represents, communities, particularly those designed for persons over 55, have issued that type of direction to their third-party vendors, so that if someone doing business with the community wants to continue doing business, the community has asked that person to certify that all their employees on site are vaccinated. I believe the federal government can do that with its contractors. It's a matter of contractual relationship. And of course, the contractor has the option of not doing business with the government if he doesn't want to comply. There may be some issues on existing contracts and whether the pandemic is kind of a force majeure, which overrules contract provisions. But I would say in most instances, the government can decide who it's going to do business with. And if it wants to do business with contractors that require vaccinations or testing in the alternative, they can.
One of the other points from the Biden administration is to require vaccinations for 17 million healthcare workers at hospitals and nursing homes and assisted living facilities that get federal money from Medicare or Medicaid. It seems to me that the federal government has the hammer here in terms of being able to hold back all those dollars, and hospitals may not have any choice to comply financially. But how enforceable, in your opinion, is that?
I believe it is enforceable to the extent that the provider isn't obligated to take money from the federal government. And if the provider doesn't want to comply, it's free to not do business with the federal government. I think that anyone who works for the federal government or does business with them will be subject to this type of direction. It's the private sector that doesn't do business with the government, and local governments and state governments that I believe should be making their own determinations on this. But I think the federal mandate on their own employees is overdue and is welcome.
As an employment expert in law, do you have people come to you and say, for whatever their reasons, want to remain unvaccinated, believing it's a matter of personal choice, asking you to represent? Or do you have either people that work alongside unvaccinated or employers who want to mandate everybody get vaccinated come to you? And if you do, what kind of advice do you give them?
If I understand your question, the employer has the right to make that decision. Typically, the advice we give them is to try and educate everyone to the pluses and minuses of the vaccination program, and to encourage individuals to speak to their physicians about what's best for them. If the employer ultimately decides that it will make vaccinations mandatory, then the employee has a decision to make. If the employee feels strongly that for reasons other than medical or religious, he or she will not get vaccinated, the employee has the option of resigning. But this is a decision that a private business or a local government needs to make.
If an individual has been working at a company, let's say 20 years, they've got a great record of, they're good workers, they're assets to the organization, they've gotten their good personnel reviews and everything like that, especially if it's one of these places that has over 100 workers, and they don't want to be vaccinated, and they take this to court. How likely are they to get a win in this? How likely are they to be able to use the courts for what they believe are their rights and keep their job but remain unvaccinated?
Well, it always depends on the surrounding facts. The employer can't make exceptions for individuals. So that if the 20-year employee and the 2-year employee, they need to be treated the same, equally. If the employer takes the position that they believe it's in the best interest of the company and their customers that their employees be vaccinated, the employer can make that decision, and the rights of the individual, in my opinion, give way because the employee is free to leave that position if he or she feels strongly about it.
Are you experiencing much of that in your position right now? Do you have employers that are concerned about the situations and that balance of what people believe are their individual rights versus what many employees believe are doing something for the overall good of everybody in the company?
Dave, everyone we represent, primarily the residential communities in the county, are going through this dilemma, and most of them have taken a step-by-step approach, starting with education, starting with encouraging the opportunity to talk to your physician, your clergyman, other people whose advice you respect, and giving employees time off. Some are even giving incentives such as cash bonuses, but ultimately the employer has a decision to make. Some employers will give the opportunity for regular testing, weekly or twice weekly, in lieu of the vaccination. Others are making it mandatory. Is it popular? I believe it's popular with the majority of the employees, but it's not popular with everyone. It's not popular with everyone, and we've seen employees resign because they don't want to be vaccinated.
We just had an excellent question. If somebody has COVID now or recently recovered from COVID, they have antibodies in the system, but just as importantly, I believe it's 60 and it may be 90 days before they can get the shot. And that happened actually to my girlfriend and my daughter's boyfriend. They're still, waiting. They're still waiting for vaccinations for the very simple reason that they got COVID. But one of the reasons that, if an employer had a mandate right now, they couldn't get vaccinated for 90 days. How much are they protected by this law? And, to take it a step further, a lot of people with COVID believe, I've got the antibodies. I don't need the vaccine, at least for a while, maybe longer than the 60 or 90 days.
If I were that employee and I felt I had the antibodies, I would go to my physician. I would be tested. And if my physician felt I was safe not being vaccinated or not being vaccinated for a certain period of time, I would ask the doctor to provide a written excuse for me and present it to the employer. And I believe most employers would consider that. The resistance, though, I'm familiar with has been, I don't want to be vaccinated, period. You can't tell me what to do. And in that case, the employer can require the mandatory vaccination program.
Do you find a lot of that during the recent surge? There were a few people that were very anti getting vaccinated, and not most necessarily, but many said, you know what, I this is hitting home. I should do it. There's a lot of other people that saw people that got COVID during the surge that may have been on the fence and pushed over to the side to get vaccinated. Are you getting that kind of feedback from employers, or do you still have people that, for their own personal reasons, are digging in their heels?
From my experience, which is limited to the local area, employers that require this do get compliance at a very high percentage. They may lose some employees or may lose one employee, but most of the employees go along with the program, some unwillingly, most willingly, and it's just a few individuals who, for various reasons, will not get vaccinated. Which is why they're offered in some companies the opportunity for regular testing if they prefer that.
When you have employers that are offering the option of you can keep your job, but you need to be tested, I think weekly is kind of the gold standard for this. How expensive is that for employers, and how, especially a mom and pop kind of business, who wants to keep their employees, even those, an employee that, because they're a good employee, they may choose not to get vaccinated. But how expensive is it? Are you getting questions like, I've got a cost benefit analysis. Do I pay to keep them,
Many of the employers are contributing to the testing, because if they lose the ability of the employees to work, it's a lot more expensive than the cost of the test. So I don't see that as a factor. I think the issue is one of conviction and culture, and it's a tough problem. But I believe that requiring federal employees to be vaccinated, the federal government's the employer, requiring people doing business with the government to have their folks vaccinated is something that's overdue. Where I draw the line is with private business, local government, state government. I believe each community has to make their own decisions.
When you talk to employers and you learn of workers that, based on their convictions, have left, how often have you found how do you find that they have a hard time finding work elsewhere, or does that not play into it?
I'm assuming that those employees are going to situations where you don't have to be vaccinated. So I have no statistical information on what occurs. I think in general, many people, having gone through the pandemic and the lockdown and the remote working and the disconnection, many people are just reconsidering whether they want to stay employed where they are employed. Staffing has become very difficult. People are reevaluating what they do and how often they do it, whether they want to do it at home or in the traditional office sense. So I think all the employers are going through issues now on staffing, recruitment, etc. The world has been changed by this. Our country has been changed, and Palm Beach County has been changed.
I'm going to wrap it up with one final question, and it was a good one. It was more of a statement, but I would like you to comment on it. Florida is, as we know, a right-to-work state. If an employer wants to dismiss somebody for not getting the vaccine, do they have to tell them, we're letting you go because you didn't get the vaccine, or can they just say, you're fired?
It's an at-will state. It's an at-will state, and the employer, unless there's a contract that the employee has, does not necessarily have to give the reason.
Simple as that. On that note, we will wrap it up. Our thanks especially to Peter Sachs, employment law specialist from Boca Raton. I appreciate you being here, and thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Dave, thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.
This is Dave Bowman, WPTV and WPTV.com signing off. Thank you so much for watching our StreamYard tonight. Hope you learned a little bit of something on employment law and what it means to you with the president's new executive orders. Have a good night.